What if the thing you were never supposed to stop doing, the thing you apologized for, softened, edited down to almost nothing, was the exact thing that would have kept you? Sit with that for a moment, because somewhere in the course of loving an avoidant, you got a very clear message, not always in words, sometimes in silences, in the slight withdrawal that followed your honesty, in the cooling that happened after you asked for too much, or took up too much space, or wanted something too directly. The message was consistent even when it was never spoken aloud. Less, be less, want less, take up less, need less. And you listened. Of course you listened. Because you loved them, and you are perceptive and you understood on some level that they were delicate in ways that weren't immediately visible. So you adjusted, you filed down the edges of your personality that felt too sharp, too loud, too much. You became more accommodating, more understanding, more endlessly patient. You made yourself into something soft and undemanding and easy to be around, and they left anyway. Or they stayed, but disappeared. Or the connection thinned until it was barely there, a filament of what it had once been. And you were standing on your side of it, wondering what happened to the person they were in the beginning. What happened to the electricity? What happened to the thing that made them look at you like you were the most interesting person they had ever encountered? Here is what happened. You stopped being selfish, and the avoidant, without fully understanding why, stopped being interested. The counterintuitive architecture of avoidant attraction. To understand why selfishness works where selflessness fails, you first have to understand what actually attracts an avoidant. Not what they say they want, not what they believe they want. What actually, neurologically, relationally draws them in and keeps them present. Avoidants are not attracted to need, not because they are cruel, but because need activates their alarm system. Someone who visibly requires them, who bends toward them like a plant toward light, who adjusts and accommodates and makes themselves smaller to fit. That person, however genuinely loving, triggers the avoidant's deepest anxiety, the anxiety of being depended upon, of being someone's source, of having another person's emotional stability become contingent on their presence. That anxiety is not rational. It is not something the avoidant consciously chooses to feel, but it is real, and it is powerful, and it reliably produces the same outcome: distance, retreat, the quiet incremental withdrawal that leaves the person on the other end wondering what they did wrong. But a person who is genuinely, unself-consciously self-possessed, a person who has their own interior life, their own pleasures, their own standards, who is not waiting to take their emotional cues from the avoidance temperature, that person does something entirely different to the avoidant nervous system. They feel safe, not safe in the sense of boring or undemanding, safe in the sense of, this person is not going to collapse if I need space. This person is not going to dissolve into me. This person has a self that exists independently of my emotional availability, and therefore being close to them does not require me to become their foundation. The avoidant can breathe around a self-possessed person, and being able to breathe is the prerequisite for everything else. What selfishness actually means here. Before going further, the word needs to be reclaimed, because selfishness has been so thoroughly demonized, particularly for people socialized to prioritize others, to be accommodating, to measure their worth by how little trouble they cause, that even reading it triggers a defensive flinch. This is not about being callous, not about disregarding the people you love, not about weaponizing your needs or becoming deliberately difficult or treating others as backdrop characters in the story of your own life. This is about something much simpler and much more fundamental: knowing what you want, pursuing it without apology, having preferences that are genuinely yours, and expressing them without first calculating whether they will be convenient for someone else, taking up the space you actually occupy rather than the reduced, careful, inoffensive space you've been told is more appropriate. It is the radical act of having a self that does not disappear when someone else enters the room. That is what avoidants are drawn to, not because they have consciously identified it as attractive, but because it is the only kind of presence that does not immediately activate their withdrawal response. The person who needs nothing from them, or more precisely, the person who can want things from them without needing them in the way that feels threatening. That person is the only one the avoidance system allows to get close. The slow erosion, and when it began, think back to the beginning, before the accommodation became habitual, before you understood the texture of their sensitivities and started preemptively adjusting for them. There was a version of you at the start of this that was simply yourself, unedited, present, opinionated about things, genuinely enthusiastic about your own life, willing to disagree, to take up space, to have a perspective that didn't defer to theirs. That version of you was the one they fell for. Not the one that came later, the more careful version, the one that had learned to read the room before speaking, that had internalized their cues and adjusted accordingly, that had made an art form out of being easy to be around. The original version, the one that was sometimes inconvenient, that wanted things directly, that was interesting in the specific way that people who haven't yet started performing for someone are interesting, unguarded, unpredictable, genuinely alive. Avoidants are magnetic in early connection precisely because they are self-contained. They are not chasing. They are not performing need. They have a life that is fully their own, and they are, with apparent effortlessness, simply living it. And that quality, that groundedness in their own existence, is deeply attractive to almost everyone, regardless of attachment style. But here is the mirror truth that rarely gets acknowledged. You were also that way in the beginning. You were also living a life that was fully your own. You were also not performing, not chasing, not adjusting. You were simply there, self-possessed, genuine, interested in them but not contingent on them. And then the dynamic shifted, and then the accommodation began, and then you slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to become the version of yourself that organized around them rather than around yourself. And the attraction, which was always partly a response to your groundedness, began to thin. What happens to their nervous system when you shrink? When you make yourself smaller around an avoidant? When you become more agreeable, less demanding, endlessly accommodating? You are trying to solve a problem. The problem of their withdrawal, the problem of the distance. You are trying to reduce the friction, to make yourself into someone their system doesn't need to retreat from. But you are solving the wrong problem, because the avoidance withdrawal is not a response to your size. It is a response to intimacy. And when you shrink yourself in response to their withdrawal, you don't reduce the intimacy. You simply add a new texture to the dynamic. Now you are smaller, yes, but you are also visibly adjusting yourself for them, which means you are oriented toward them, organized around them, watching them for cues. And an avoidant can feel that orientation. It reads to their nervous system not as comfort, but as pressure. Not as ease, but as need wearing a disguise. The need is still there. It has simply changed its form from direct expression to anxious accommodation. And the anxious accommodation in some ways is more activating than the direct expression would have been, because it signals clearly, this person is managing themselves around me. This person's behavior is contingent on mine. I have become someone's reference point. And that, for the avoidant, is exactly the kind of weight they cannot carry. So the shrinking, the thing you did with such care and such love and such genuine desire to make things easier, created the opposite of what you needed. It made you less attractive to them, not because you became less worthy, but because you became less autonomous. You started to look to their nervous system like someone who needed them to be okay. And that need, however disguised, however generously motivated, is the thing the avoidant is most constitutionally unable to hold. The specific things they were drawn to that you stopped doing. There were things about you early on that made them lean in, specific qualities that created the sense of encountering someone genuinely alive, genuinely their own person. And these are almost always the first things to go when the accommodation begins. Your directness, the way you said what you meant without wrapping it in 7 layers of qualification, the way you expressed a preference as a preference rather than as a tentative suggestion, awaiting their approval. That quality, The willingness to simply state what is true for you reads as confidence to an avoidant, as someone who exists independently of their response. And independence in another person is the one thing that makes the avoidant feel they are not in danger of being consumed. Your full volume enthusiasm, the specific, unguarded way you cared about things, not performed excitement, genuine, somewhat uninhibited investment in your own pleasures and interests and passions. That quality has a vitality to it that is magnetic to people who have suppressed their own emotional range. The avoidant is drawn to someone who feels fully, partly because they have spent years managing their own emotional experience into something much smaller. Your fullness of feeling was never the problem. It was the draw, your willingness to walk away, not as a tactic, not as a strategy, but the genuine, non-performative sense that you had a life and standards and a self-respect that existed prior to them and would continue to exist regardless of their choices. The avoidant was attracted to the version of you that was not waiting for them to decide your worth, that knew your worth independently, that would, when the situation called for it, simply leave your inconvenient opinions, the moments when you disagreed with them, when you challenged an idea, held a different position, brought a perspective that didn't simply validate theirs. This is counterintuitive. Most people in relationships smooth over disagreement in the interest of harmony. But for an avoidant, someone who agrees with everything is someone who has no self. And someone with no self is someone they will eventually have nothing to encounter. The friction of your genuine difference was not a problem in the relationship. It was part of what made the relationship alive. The exhausting performance of selflessness here is something that deserves to be said plainly. The selflessness you performed in this relationship was not sustainable, not because generosity is wrong, but because the generosity was not coming from fullness. It was coming from from the fear of being too much, from the fear of triggering their withdrawal, from the belief quietly installed by the dynamic itself that your needs were the variable causing the problem, and that reducing them would reduce the distance. Generosity from fear is not generosity. It is self-erasure with a kind name, and it is exhausting in a way that genuine generosity never is. Genuine generosity, the kind that comes from someone who is already full, who has already met their own needs and has something left over to offer. That kind of giving does not deplete, it circulates. It feels natural and sustainable and free. But self-erasure dressed as generosity, that requires constant maintenance, constant monitoring, constant suppression of the authentic responses that keep arising despite your best efforts to eliminate them. It requires you to perform a version of yourself that is not actually you. And performances, however skilled, are never effortless. The effort accumulates. The resentment accumulates. The grief of your own self-abandonment accumulates. And the person on the receiving end, the avoidant, can feel the performance, maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way they could articulate, but on the level of attunement, on the level of the nervous system's exquisite sensitivity to authenticity, they can feel that what they are receiving is not the real thing, that there is management happening, that the ease is effortful, and effortful ease is its own kind of pressure. Reclaiming the selfishness they actually need. So what does it look like, practically, to reclaim the selfishness that both of you needed you to have? It looks like wanting things without first checking whether the wanting is convenient. It looks like having evenings that are genuinely yours, not performances of independence designed to seem less needy, but actual investment in your own life, your own pleasure, your own restoration, so that when you come to the relationship, you come full rather than hungry. It looks like expressing disagreement when you genuinely disagree, not combatively, not to create friction for its own sake, but because a relationship in which one person never disagrees is not a relationship between two people. It is a relationship between a person and their own reflection. It looks like having standards that you enforce, not because you read somewhere that standards are attractive, though they are, but because you actually value yourself enough to require that certain things be present and certain things be absent. And because when those standards are violated, You respond to the violation rather than explaining it away. It looks like pursuing your own ambitions, interests, and desires with the same energy you brought to understanding and accommodating theirs, not instead of caring for them, alongside, simultaneously, as a person who has a full life that is not contingent on the relationship for its meaning. It looks like taking up the space you actually occupy, not performing largeness, but stopping the active work of compression, letting yourself be the size you actually are. What this changes in the dynamic. When you stop accommodating and start simply being, something shifts in the avoidance nervous system. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but the quality of the encounter changes, because now they are not encountering someone who is organized around them. They are encountering someone who is organized around themselves. And that is, for the avoidant, the relational equivalent of fresh air. It is the one configuration in which they can breathe, without the low-level anxiety that someone is depending on them for oxygen. The pursuit impulse, which in avoidance is often most activated precisely when someone is not chasing, begins to stir, not because you are playing games, not because withholding affection is a strategy, but because you are genuinely present in your own life, genuinely invested in your own experience, and that investment makes you someone worth pursuing, rather than someone who is already fully available. Avoidance, for all their discomfort with intimacy, do not want a relationship with someone who has nothing of their own. The self-sufficiency they project is also, to a significant degree, what they find attractive in others. They want to be with someone who doesn't need them, not because they want to be unimportant, but because being unneeded is the only condition under which they feel free enough to choose to be present. The paradox is exquisite and infuriating in equal measure. They want to be chosen, not needed. They want to be wanted, not depended upon. They want to come to you freely, not be held in place by the weight of your requirement. And the only way to create that space, the only way to invite the free choice, rather than the pressured presence, is to need them less, not by suppressing the need, but by actually genuinely substantively filling your own life until the need for them becomes a want, a preference, a delight, rather than a necessity. The deepest truth about what they need from you here is the thing that sits underneath everything else. The thing that, if you could absorb it fully, would change not just how you navigate this relationship, but how you carry yourself through every relationship that follows. The avoidant does not need you to understand them better, does not need you to be more patient, more accommodating, more skilled at reading their signals and adjusting accordingly. They have plenty of people in their life, or at least, they have the capacity to find plenty of people who will contort themselves into comfortable shapes around the avoidance limitations. What they need, what actually reaches them, what actually creates the conditions for real intimacy, rather than managed distance, is someone who refuses to contort, someone who is so genuinely, unperformatively themselves that the avoidance nervous system registers for perhaps the first time that being close to this person does not require them to become responsible for that person's wholeness, that this person is already whole, already full, already standing in their own life with a stability that does not depend on the avoidance consistency. That person, the whole, full, self-possessed, uncontorted person, is not a threat to the avoidance system. They are a relief to it. They are the first person in a long time with whom the avoidant can be genuinely present without the constant background noise of anxiety about the cost of that presence. And that is the extraordinary, counterintuitive, quietly revolutionary truth about what the avoidant needs from you. Not less of yourself, more, fully unapologetically, inconveniently more. The version of you that doesn't wait for permission to take up space, that doesn't edit the laugh before it arrives, that wants what it wants and says so, and then gets on with the business of living, regardless of the response. That version, the one you were before the accommodation began, the one you have been quietly shrinking away from in the name of love, that is the version that makes an avoidant lean in rather than pull back. That is the version worth returning to. Not for them. That is the critical distinction. Not as a strategy, not as a recalibration designed to produce a specific response in them, but for you, because that version is simply who you are. And who you are, without apology, without compression, without the exhausting performance of being less, is more than enough. It always was. Avoidants love your selfishness. There is something that hasn't been said yet, something that lives just underneath everything covered so far, quieter than the psychology, more personal than the theory, more uncomfortable than anything that can be explained through attachment science alone. You already understand the dynamic intellectually. You understand that selfishness, in the reclaimed sense, is not cruelty, but self-possession. You understand that accommodation erodes attraction. You understand that the avoidant needs your wholeness more than your compliance. But understanding it and living it are separated by a distance that is almost entirely emotional. And that distance is where most people get stuck, not in the knowing, in the doing. In the moment where the understanding meets the actual texture of your life and your habits and the deeply ingrained patterns of how you move through love. So this continues not as more theory, but as the part that goes deeper, the part that asks harder questions, the part that looks directly at why. Even knowing all of this, returning to yourself is still the most difficult thing you will ever do. The identity you built around being needed, somewhere before the avoidant, before this relationship, before the accommodation became a pattern, there was a story you were already telling yourself about what made you lovable. And for many people who find themselves in this dynamic, that story had the same essential shape, that you were loved for what you gave, that your value in a relationship was located in your capacity to understand, to nurture, to hold space, to be the person who always knew what someone else needed and provided it before being asked. This is not a flaw. In fact, it is a profound gift. The attunement, the empathy, the capacity to see another person's interior and respond to it with care. These are genuinely extraordinary qualities. The world is not overrun with people who love with that level of presence and intention. But a gift, when it becomes the sole basis of your sense of worth, stops being a gift and becomes a trap. Because if you believe on the quiet, foundational level where beliefs actually operate, that you are lovable primarily because of what you provide, then selfishness feels like dismantling the very thing that makes you worth keeping. It feels like removing the offering and standing there with empty hands, waiting to see if you are still wanted when you are no longer useful. That fear is real. It is not irrational. It is in fact a perfectly logical response to a belief that was likely installed early and has been reinforced by every relationship since. The belief that love is transactional, that it must be earned through service, through understanding, through the consistent prioritization of someone else's needs over your own. And the avoidant relationship, with its specific texture of emotional unavailability and intimate warmth, is almost perfectly designed to activate and reinforce exactly that belief. Because the warmth, when it comes, often comes in response to your accommodation. When you ask for less, they come closer. When you make yourself smaller, the temperature rises briefly, and your nervous system, responding to that intermittent reward, learns, again, in the same old groove, that less of you produces more of them. So you give less of yourself and receive less of them, and the loop tightens. The specific moment, the editing begins. It doesn't happen all at once. That's the thing nobody tells you. The self-erasure in an avoidant relationship is not a dramatic decision. It is a sequence of tiny, individually reasonable adjustments that accumulate into something unrecognizable. It starts with something small. You notice that a particular kind of expression, enthusiasm that runs too hot, a need stated too directly, an emotion that arrives with too much volume, produces a cooling in them. Not a fight, not a confrontation, just a slight withdrawal, a fractional decrease in their presence, and you file that information away. Not consciously, but it goes in. The next time that kind of expression arises, something catches it before it arrives fully formed. A small internal edit, a slight reduction in volume, a need reframed as a preference, a preference reframed as an observation offered tentatively with an exit already built into it. And the cooling doesn't come, and your nervous system registers correctly in the narrowest technical sense that the adjustment worked, that the smaller version of that expression was receivable where the larger version was not. So the editing becomes a habit, automatic, preconscious. You stop noticing you're doing it because you have been doing it long enough that it feels like simply knowing how to communicate, like having learned the grammar of this particular relationship. But grammar shapes thought, and the grammar of perpetual self-reduction, practiced long enough, begins to reshape not just how you express yourself, but what you allow yourself to feel. Because feeling things fully, when you have learned that full feeling is too much, starts to feel dangerous even in the privacy of your own interior. You begin editing yourself to yourself. That is the moment the real damage begins. Not when you adjusted your expression for them, but when the adjustment traveled inward and started reshaping what you permit yourself to experience. Why returning to yourself feels like risk here is why reclaiming your selfishness, your self-possession, your full presence, your unapologetic occupation of your own life feels not like liberation, but like danger. Because you have been operating, for however long this dynamic has been running, in a state where the full version of yourself was associated with loss, with cooling, with the fractional but unmistakable withdrawal that told you too much, too loud, too present. Your nervous system learned that equation. Full self equals rejection. Reduced self equals proximity. And even when proximity is thin and unsatisfying and bears only a faint resemblance to the genuine connection you actually need, it is proximity. It is the avoidance still in the room, still occasionally warm, still the person you love, however partially available. And the nervous system will choose thin proximity over the terrifying uncertainty of full self-expression, every time, without asking your permission. This is not a character failure. It is a survival response. The nervous system does not optimize for your long-term flourishing. It optimizes for the reduction of immediate threat. And the immediate threat, as your system has learned it, is the possibility of their withdrawal. So returning to yourself, expressing needs directly, taking up space, pursuing your own desires without preemptively calculating their response, feels, in the body, like walking toward the withdrawal, like deliberately triggering the thing you have spent months learning to avoid. It feels like choosing to be abandoned. That feeling is not the truth, but it is real. And it is the thing that sits between understanding this intellectually and actually living it. The body's conviction that being yourself is the fastest route to losing them. Dismantling that conviction is not a cognitive exercise. It is not accomplished by reading the right words or understanding the right framework. It requires repetition, the slow accumulation of experiences in which you are fully yourself and the world does not end, in which you express a need and it is met, or you survive its not being met, in which you take up space and the right people stay and the wrong ones leave, and you discover, gradually, unevenly, sometimes with your heart in your throat, that you are actually survivable when you are fully yourself. That discovery is not made once. It is made again and again, in small moments, until the nervous system finally begins to revise its prediction. The attraction they won't admit to. There is something the avoidant will rarely say directly, something they may not even consciously recognize as a pattern in their own responses. But it is there, observable in the trajectory of almost every avoidant relationship, if you know where to look. They are most drawn to you when you are least available. Not unavailable in a cold or manufactured way, but genuinely, naturally, unperformatively occupied with your own life. When you are in a period of deep investment in your work, your friendships, your creative life, when you are, in the most organic sense, pointed toward yourself rather than toward them, the avoidance interest sharpens. Their pursuit instinct wakes up. They reach out more, initiate more, are more willing to be present and open and genuinely there. And the moment you turn toward them, the moment the attention shifts from your life to the relationship, From your own fullness to the dynamic between you, the quality of their engagement subtly changes, not always dramatically, but the edge comes off it, the pursuit quiets, the presence becomes slightly more managed. This is maddening. It is also entirely consistent with everything that has already been said, because the avoidant is most comfortable approaching what is not oriented toward them, most able to move forward when they are not being waited for, most genuinely interested when your interest is genuinely divided between them and the rest of your rich, full, unapologetically lived life. The practical implication of this is uncomfortable but important. Investing in your own life is not a strategy for managing the avoidance response. It should never be reduced to that. But it is also not incidentally attractive to them. It is the primary condition under which their system allows genuine closeness. When you are full, they can approach without the anxiety of being needed to fill you. When you are occupied, they can pursue without the pressure of being your entire world. Your life, vivid, full, genuinely yours, is not the competition for the relationship. It is the foundation that makes the relationship possible. The difference between performing independence and living it here is where a critical distinction needs to be drawn, because the concept of selfishness, of self-possession, of not orienting around the avoidant, this can be misunderstood into something that causes its own damage. There are people who, having understood this dynamic, attempt to manufacture the detachment they have not actually cultivated. They perform independence as a strategy. They create deliberate distance, manufacture busyness, respond with studied casualness to communications they are actually aching to respond to fully, all in the calculated hope that this performed unavailability will trigger the avoidance pursuit. This does not work, or rather, it sometimes produces a short-term response that mimics what genuine self-possession produces, but it is ultimately hollow, because it is still organized around the avoidance response. It is still a behavior generated by the relationship dynamic, rather than by genuine investment in one's own life. It is avoidance wearing the costume of confidence, and the avoidant, whose nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to authenticity, will eventually feel the difference between someone who is genuinely occupied with their own life and someone who is performing occupation as a relational strategy. The only version that actually works, the only version worth pursuing, for reasons that have nothing to do with the avoidant and everything to do with the quality of your own existence, is the real thing. Actually investing in your life, actually rebuilding or deepening the friendships that got quieter when the relationship consumed your attention, actually returning to the interests and ambitions and daily pleasures that make you someone who is interesting to yourself, not just to someone else. Actually doing the work, the therapy, the reflection, the honest confrontation with your own attachment patterns that allows you to be present in a relationship without losing your center. That investment is not a tactic. It is the thing itself, the destination, not just the path to someone else's approval. What they see when you stop waiting, the moment you genuinely stop waiting for them, not performing the stopping, not white-knuckling through a performance of not caring, but actually redirecting your investment toward your own life with real commitment. Something changes in how they experience you. It is almost impossible to describe without sounding like strategy, but it is not strategy. It is simply the natural consequence of presence. When you are no longer waiting, you become present, not present in the relationship in a way that is organized around their response, but present in your own life in a way that has gravity and texture and genuine vitality. You become, again, the person who has something going on, who is interesting because they are genuinely interested in their own existence, who occupies space naturally rather than carefully. The avoidant notices this shift not as a specific observation, but as a felt change in the quality of the encounter. Something in you has settled. The low-level anxiety that previously accompanied your presence, the monitoring, the calibrating, the perpetual attunement to their temperature, is quieter, or gone entirely, and in its place is something that reads, to their nervous system, as groundedness. Groundedness is the quality the avoidant cannot manufacture for themselves. Their system is constitutionally restless, always scanning, always calculating the cost of closeness, always half-oriented toward the exit. And encountering someone who is not restless in that way, who is simply solidly, unperformatively present in themselves, creates a stillness in the dynamic that the avoidant has rarely experienced. It does not fix them. It does not resolve their attachment wound or make sustained intimacy suddenly easy for them. But it creates the conditions, the only conditions under which their system might actually allow closeness rather than reflexively defending against it. And even if it doesn't, even if the avoidance system does what it does regardless of the quality of your presence, you are still better, still more alive, still more fully yourself than the carefully managed, perpetually accommodating version you had been maintaining, which means you win either way. The freedom on the other side of this. There is a version of you that exists on the other side of reclaiming your selfishness, and it is worth describing because it is the actual destination of everything being said here. It is a version of you that moves through relationships without the constant background calculation of whether you are too much. That expresses needs directly, without the 7 layers of softening, not because it has become aggressive or demanding, but because it has become secure. Secure enough to state what is true without preemptively managing the other person's response. It is a version of you that finds the right relationships less effortful, not effortless. Real intimacy always requires effort, always requires navigation and repair and the ongoing work of showing up. But the particular exhaustion of perpetual self-monitoring, of editing before speaking, of shrinking before entering, that exhaustion is gone. Because the right relationships, the ones that are actually a match for who you fully are, do not require that maintenance. It is a version of you that, when confronted with someone whose system cannot hold your full presence without withdrawing, recognizes that incompatibility early, clearly, without needing to spend months or years trying to make yourself small enough to fit through a space that was never designed for someone of your actual size. That version knows their own value not as a concept, but as a felt reality, not arrogantly, not performatively, but in the quiet, unshakable way of someone who has spent enough time in their own company to know that they are, at full volume, genuinely worth knowing. And perhaps most importantly, that version is capable of the kind of love that is actually sustainable, the love that comes from fullness rather than hunger, that gives from abundance rather than in hope of reciprocity, that chooses rather than clings, that stays not because leaving feels impossible, but because staying is genuinely, freely chosen. That love, the love of a person who is already whole, who does not need the relationship to complete them, but delights in it as an addition to an already rich life, is the most magnetic, most sustaining, most genuinely connecting form of love available. It is also, not coincidentally, the only kind of love the avoidant can actually receive without their system treating it as a threat. You came into this wanting to understand them, to understand the push and pull, the warmth and the withdrawal, the love that was real but somehow never enough to make them stay. And everything here has been an attempt to hand you that understanding, fully, without softening it into false comfort. But the final thing, the thing that matters more than any insight about avoidant attachment, more than any framework for understanding their behavior, is this. The selfishness being asked of you here is not a concession to their limitations. It is not a strategy for keeping them interested or a technique for managing their withdrawal response. It is an invitation back to yourself, to the version of you that existed before the accommodation became a habit, before the editing became automatic, before you started measuring the size of your own feelings against someone else's capacity to receive them. That version, unedited, fully occupied with their own life, wanting what they want without apology, is not too much for the right love. They are exactly enough. They always were. And the moment you genuinely believe that, not as an affirmation, not as a thing you tell yourself because you read it somewhere, but as a lived, embodied, unshakable truth, is the moment everything changes. Not just with the avoidant, with everything.